The moment my father looked me in the eye at his own while reading and said, "You can rot in your worthless mud," I stopped breathing for a second. Then he pushed a leather folder across the table to my sister, Gemma, $50 million in estates, investments, and family trusts, while leaving me with nothing but humiliation. No explanation. No hesitation. Just a lifetime of being treated like I was disposable, condensed into one sentence that burned deeper than any slap ever could. I watched my mother lower her eyes without defending me, and I realized I was losing more than an inheritance. I was losing the last illusion that I had ever been part of that family. But before anyone could leave, Grandpa's attorney quietly stood up, produced a red wax-sealed envelope no one knew existed, and said he had one final instruction to fulfill. The silence that followed was suffocating, and what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The air in Vaughn's downtown office was thick, smelling of old paper, lemon polish, and the suffocating cloud of my mother's expensive floral perfume. I sat at the far end of the long conference table, feeling entirely out of place. I had rushed here straight from the harbor. My boots were still faintly damp with salt water, my hair tied in a messy knot, and my jacket smelled like the ocean breeze. Across from me sat my family, looking like they had stepped out of a luxury magazine catalog. My mother, Daphne, wore a tailored black dress that screamed quiet wealth, her wrists dripping with pearls. My father, Preston, adjusted his silk tie, his posture rigid with an unearned sense of superiority. And then there was Gemma, my younger sister, the golden child. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the wood, acting as if this entire solemn occasion was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her busy schedule as a lifestyle influencer. Grandpa Alden had passed away 3 weeks ago. The grief was still a heavy stone sitting right in the center of my chest. He was the only person in this room who had ever looked at me and seen something worth loving. But as Vaughn read through the standard legal jargon, the atmosphere grew tense. My father had taken over the reading of the primary assets, a power play he insisted upon. He wanted to be the one to deliver the news. He wanted to be the one holding the crown. Gemma gets the coastal mansion, the investment portfolios, and the remaining liquid assets totaling roughly $50 million, Preston announced, his voice booming with pride. He slid the thick leather binder across the table. Gemma barely looked at it. She just smirked, adjusting her sunglasses, and whispered a quiet, "Finally." My hands gripped the edge of my chair. I did not care about the money. I never had. But the sheer blatant inequality, the deliberate exclusion, stung like a physical blow. I looked at my father. "And what about the harbor property?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Grandpa and I spent years there," he promised. Preston did not even let me finish. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and fixed me with a stare so full of contempt it made my stomach turn. "You get nothing, Vera. Not a single dime. You chose to waste your life playing with sea slugs and mud while your sister built a real brand. A real legacy. So, as far as this family is concerned, you can go back to your dirty little boats and rot." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother let out a soft, breathy sigh of agreement, sipping her sparkling water as if my father had just commented on the weather. Gemma let out a tiny, high-pitched giggle. I felt the blood rush to my face. The humiliation burned in my throat. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. I was ready to walk out. I was ready to leave them to their toxic, hollow lives. But before I could take a single step toward the heavy oak doors, a voice cut through the tension. "Wait." It was Vaughn. The elderly lawyer had been sitting quietly, his hands folded patiently over his leather briefcase. He stood up slowly, his face an unreadable mask. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a small, crisp envelope. It was sealed with bright red wax, stamped with Grandpa Alden's personal crest. "Robert," Vaughn said, his voice surprisingly firm, addressing my father. "You are reading from the preliminary trust allocation. But you failed to mention the addendum." My father frowned, his arrogant facade slipping just a fraction. "Addendum? There is no addendum." I went through his papers myself. You went through the papers he allowed you to see, Vaughn corrected smoothly. This envelope was entrusted to me directly by Alden, with strict instructions. It is to be opened only when Vera is present, and only after the primary trust has been disclosed. My mother's posture stiffened. What is the meaning of this, Vaughn? She demanded, her voice shrill. Preston, tell him to put that away. Everything has been settled. Vaughn ignored her. He walked around the large table, stopping right in front of me. He held out the envelope. His eyes were kind, holding a depth of sorrow and understanding that nearly broke my resolve. This is for you, Vera, he said softly. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I took the envelope. The paper was heavy, the red wax cool to the touch. I looked down at my name, written in Grandpa's familiar, elegant script. A sudden wave of emotion hit me so hard my knees felt weak. Open it right now. Gemma snapped, dropping her influencer persona entirely. Her voice was harsh, grating. If that crazy old man gave you any of my properties, we are taking you to court. I did not look at her. I did not look at my parents, who were now standing up, their faces pale with sudden panic. I clutched the envelope tightly to my chest. Without a word, I turned on my heel and walked out of the room. The heavy doors slammed shut behind me, but I could still hear my mother start screaming, demanding Vaughn explain himself, demanding my father fix this. But I was already gone. I practically ran down the hallway, the sound of my boots echoing off the marble floors. I burst out into the cool afternoon air, gasping for breath as if I had been drowning. When I finally reached my rusty, 10-year-old car, I locked the doors and stared at the red seal. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the paper. What did you do, Grandpa? I whispered to the empty car. As my fingers dug into the wax seal, ready to tear it open, I had no idea that the few lines written inside this letter were about to spark a fire that would burn my family's empire to the ground. If you have ever been the black sheep, if you have ever had your own family spit in your face, hit that like button, because you're going to want to hear how I turned their $50 million victory into a living nightmare. The drive out of the city was a blur. The skyscrapers faded into suburban sprawl, and eventually, the scenery shifted into the rugged, windswept coastline that I called home. I drove aimlessly for an hour, the unopened envelope sitting on the passenger seat, mocking me, comforting me, terrifying me. I needed to clear my head before I opened it. I rolled down the window, letting the harsh, salty air sting my cheeks. It was the same air I breathed every day at work, the same air that my family so deeply despised. As the tires hummed against the asphalt, my mind drifted back, pulling me into a museum of painful memories I usually kept firmly locked away. The exhibits were everywhere, painted vividly across my mind. I was 29 years old, but right now I felt like that lonely, invisible girl all over again. Exhibit 1. 8th grade. The State Science Fair. I had spent 4 agonizing months building a complex, functioning model of a marine ecosystem. I had meticulously researched coral bleaching, spending my meager allowance on tiny pumps and pH sensors. I was so proud. The night of the exhibition, I wore my best dress, waiting by my project for my parents to arrive. I watched other kids' parents taking photos, beaming with pride, carrying balloons. I waited for 3 hours. They never showed up. When I finally got home, carrying my first-place ribbon, the house was dark except for Gemma's bedroom. My mother was in there, fussing over a velvet gown. They had spent the entire evening at a fitting for Gemma's upcoming junior beauty pageant. When I held up my ribbon, my mother barely glanced at it. "That is nice, Vera," she had said, not even turning around. "But look at this hemline. Gemma is going to look like an absolute angel." I remembered crying myself to sleep that night. But the next morning, Grandpa Alden had showed up. He did not say a word about my parents' absence. Instead, he handed me a neatly folded white package. It was a real, professional-grade lab coat, tailored to fit my small frame. "You have a brilliant mind, Vera," he had told me, his rough, weathered hands resting on my shoulders. "Do not let anyone dim your light just because they are too blind to see it." Exhibit 2. College. The memory that still made my blood boil with a toxic mixture of rage and betrayal. It was my junior year. I was working on a massive research paper on deep-sea currents, gathering data that I had spent countless nights compiling in the university lab. I had a worn leather notebook where I kept all my raw data, my observations, my late-night epiphanies. I had brought it home during Thanksgiving break. Gemma, who was failing her communications major and desperate for a quick way to launch her eco-friendly influencer persona, found it. She stole it. She literally stole my notebook, took my raw data, and pitched it to a local environmental startup as her own independent research. She got a massive sponsorship deal out of it. When I found out and confronted her, screaming in the living room, my parents did not punish her. They turned on me. Preston had pulled me aside, gripping my arm so hard it bruised. "You will keep your mouth shut, Vera," he had hissed, his eyes cold and calculating. "Gemma is building a brand. She has the face for this. You're just a lab rat. If you ruin this for her, I will cut your tuition off tomorrow." I was forced to watch my sister go on local morning shows, smiling her perfect smile, talking about oceanic conservation using my words, my sleepless nights, my passion. And my parents stood in the wings, clapping. That was the day I realized I did not have a family. I had a group of people who shared my DNA and viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be harvested or an obstacle to be crushed. Exhibit 3. The present day. The stark, ironic contrast of our lives. I am a marine biologist. I spend my days on small, rocking boats, diving into freezing waters to graft coral reefs and monitor ocean acidity. I am constantly covered in salt, sand, and occasionally fish guts. I make barely enough to cover my rent and my student loans. But I sleep soundly at night, knowing I am actually doing something real. Gemma, on the other hand, runs the Blue Horizon Foundation, a supposed marine charity. Her job consists of putting on designer bikinis, flying to luxury resorts in the Maldives or Bora Bora, picking up exactly 3 pieces of driftwood for an Instagram photo, and then drinking champagne on a yacht while writing captions about saving the turtles. She makes millions. Society praises her. My parents worship her. And whenever we were forced to be in the same room, they looked at my calloused hands and sunburned shoulders with undisguised disgust. The wind whipped through my hair, snapping me out of the memories. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. The Museum of Pain was closed for the day. I was done feeling sorry for myself. I looked over at the red envelope on the passenger seat. I needed to see Grandma Mabel. She was the only one besides Grandpa who had ever treated me like a human being. After Grandpa died, my parents told me she had suffered a severe mental decline. They said she was moved to an isolated memory care facility and that visitors would only agitate her. I had been grieving so hard and working so many double shifts to keep my research afloat that I had believed them. But something felt wrong. The way Preston looked at me today. The sheer venom in his voice. I needed to know the truth. I turned the car around, heading toward the old coastal cabin where my grandparents had lived for 40 years. If she was truly gone, the house would be empty. But I had to see it for myself. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, the engine whining in protest. Little did I know, the destination I was driving toward would shatter the last remaining illusion I had about my family and give me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. The coastal road narrowed, winding through dense pine trees before opening up to the breathtaking view of the harsh, rocky shoreline. Grandpa's cabin sat on a small bluff overlooking the churning gray water. It was a sturdy, weathered house, built to withstand storms. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, my heart pounded against my ribs. The place looked untouched. The porch swing swayed slightly in the wind. The flower beds were tidy. This did not look like an abandoned house. This looked like someone was still fighting to keep it alive. I turned off the engine and grabbed the red envelope, stuffing it deep into my jacket pocket. I walked up the wooden steps, the wood groaning beneath my weight. I raised my fist and knocked on the heavy oak door. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. "Go away, Preston. I already told you I am not signing those damn papers," a voice shouted from inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was not the weak, confused voice of a woman losing her mind. It was sharp, clear, and full of gravelly authority. It was Grandma Mabel. Grandma? I called out, my voice cracking. It is me. It is Vera. There was a long silence. Then, the sound of multiple deadbolts clicking. The door swung open slowly. Grandma Mabel stood there. She looked older, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun, deep lines of grief etched around her eyes. She leaned heavily on a wooden cane, but her eyes, those sharp, piercing blue eyes, were exactly as I remembered them. But right now, they were not looking at me with warmth. They were looking at me with a freezing, devastating anger. Well, she said, her voice dripping with ice. Look who finally decided to show up. I stood there, paralyzed. Grandma, what are you talking about? Mom and Dad told me you were in a memory care unit. They said I could not visit you. They said, Grandpa, my voice broke, tears threatening to spill over. They said he went peacefully in his sleep at the facility. Mabel's grip on her cane tightened until her knuckles turned stark white. Her eyes narrowed, searching my face for any sign of deception. You did not know he was here? In this house? Dying in his own bed for the last 2 months? My stomach plummeted. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. No, I whispered, horrified. No, they told me he was transferred. They told me. Do not lie to me, Vera. Mabel suddenly barked, slamming her cane against the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. He asked for you. Every single day. As his lungs failed him, he asked where his little scientist was. He wanted to see you one last time. And you never came. You never even called. I felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I dropped to my knees right there on the porch. I swear to God, Grandma. I did not know. I called the facility every day. They said he was resting and could not take calls. I never stopped caring. Why would I ever abandon him? He was my everything. I was sobbing now, the raw agony of missing his final moments tearing me apart. Mabel watched me for a long time. The anger in her eyes slowly cracked, replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow. She turned around and gestured with her head. Come inside. I stumbled to my feet and followed her into the warm, familiar living room. It smelled of peppermint tea and old wood. Mabel walked over to a small table near the window and picked up a worn, leather-bound notebook. She walked back to me and shoved it into my hands. His phone log, she said quietly, her voice trembling now. He made Preston dial the number for him because his hands were shaking too much. Look at it. I wiped my eyes and looked down at the pages. Grandpa had meticulously recorded every time he tried to reach me. Date, time, and the number dialed. I stared at the string of digits. My blood ran cold. This is not my number, I whispered, staring at the ink. Grandma, this is not my phone number. I have had the same number for 8 years. Mabel froze. What do you mean? Preston read that number off your contact card. Daphne confirmed it. They told us you changed your number right after your last fight with Gemma. They told us you said you were done with this toxic family and wanted nothing to do with any of us. They told him you hated him for not stopping the fight. A wave of nausea washed over me so violently I had to grab the back of the sofa to steady myself. They lied. Preston and Daphne had deliberately given my dying grandfather a fake number. They had intercepted my calls to the fake facility. They had painted me as a monster, isolating him in his final days, all to ensure they had total control over his narrative and, probably, his assets. They let him die thinking the granddaughter he loved had abandoned him in disgust. The cruelty of it was unfathomable. It was not just greed. It was pure, unadulterated evil. They lied, Grandma, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. My tears dried up instantly, replaced by a raging, burning inferno inside my chest. They lied to him. They lied to you. And they stole my goodbye. Mabel sank into an armchair. She covered her face with her wrinkled hands, letting out a shattered, broken sob that ripped my heart to shreds. Oh, Alden, she wept. My poor Alden. He thought you walked away. I knelt beside her, wrapping my arms around her frail shoulders. We stayed like that for a long time, two women broken by the people who were supposed to protect us. But as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the living room, the grief in the room began to shift. It hardened. It crystallized into something cold and sharp. Mabel slowly lowered her hands. She looked at me, her blue eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. She reached for her cane and stood up, moving with a sudden, rigid purpose. She walked straight to the old rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall. "Grandma, what are you doing?" I asked, standing up. She picked up the receiver and began dialing the heavy numbers. Her voice was no longer that of a grieving widow. It was the voice of a matriarch preparing for war. "I am calling your father," she said, not looking at me. "I am telling them they need to come here to finalize the estate transfer. They think they have won. They think they buried the truth with my husband." She turned to look at me, the phone cord spiraling in her hand. "But they forgot one thing. I am still breathing. And so are you. Now, what is in that envelope in your pocket, Vera?" I slept on the old couch in the living room that night, the envelope resting safely under my pillow. We decided to wait for daylight to open it, needing clear heads for whatever Grandpa had left behind. But the universe, or rather my family, was not going to let me rest. At exactly 6 in the morning, my phone buzzed violently against the wooden floorboards. I jolted awake, my heart racing. I grabbed it, squinting at the bright screen. It was Callum, my research partner and the closest thing I had to a best friend. "Callum? What is wrong?" I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Vera, you need to get down to the bank or call someone right now." Callum's voice was panicked, breathless. "I just tried to buy the liquid nitrogen for the reef samples. The card declined." I checked the portal. "The entire research account has been frozen. Locked down tight." I sat up instantly, throwing off the blanket. "Frozen? What do you mean frozen? We have enough grant money to last the next 6 months." "Not anymore," Callum said grimly. "The bank rep said someone executed a power of attorney early this morning. They flagged the account for suspicious mismanagement and froze all assets pending a full review. Vera, if we do not get that nitrogen by tomorrow, 3 months of coral grafting dies." "A power of attorney?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is impossible. I am the sole director of the project. I never signed." I stopped. The memory hit me like a freight train. College. The year Gemma stole my notebook. My parents had threatened to cut my tuition. To prove they were generous, Preston had forced me to sign a stack of financial aid and banking documents, claiming it was for a student trust to manage my expenses. I was young, terrified, and cornered. I signed them without reading the fine print. "Preston," I whispered, my blood running cold. "He still has POA." Callum groaned. "Oh God, Vera. Your dad? Why would he do this? What the hell is going on?" "I will fix this, Callum. Just keep the samples on ice as best as you can." "I am so sorry." I hung up the phone before he could ask more questions. My hands were shaking. This was a warning strike. Preston knew I was angry yesterday. He knew I had the envelope from Vaughn. This was his way of reminding me who held the leash. He was squeezing my oxygen supply, threatening the only thing I cared about, my work, my corals, my purpose, to force me into submission. A notification pinged on my screen. A direct message on Instagram. It was from Stella. Stella was Gemma's best friend, a vapid, cruel girl who functioned as Gemma's personal attack dog. She was the ultimate flying monkey. I opened the message. It was a photo of Gemma and Stella lounging on the deck of a massive, sleek yacht. Gemma was wearing a white bikini, holding a glass of mimosa, looking utterly unbothered. The caption read, "Celebrating 50 million reasons to smile. So glad the universe rewards good people. Let me know if you need me to send you some table scraps, you ragged little scientist. XOXO. I stared at the screen. The sheer audacity. The absolute lack of humanity. They had stolen my grandfather's dying moments. They had humiliated me in front of the lawyer. They were actively trying to destroy my career. And now they were laughing about it on a yacht paid for by the man they had deceived. A strange calm washed over me. It was not the frantic panic from earlier. It was a cold, absolute certainty. I had spent my entire life trying to be the bigger person. I had absorbed their insults, their theft, their cruelty, hoping that one day they would see my value. I was done. They wanted to play dirty? They had no idea the kind of pressure I was used to operating under. I worked at the bottom of the ocean. I knew how to survive in the crushing dark. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. Grandma Mabel was already awake, brewing coffee. She looked at me, seeing the murder in my eyes. "What did they do now?" she asked, pouring a cup and handing it to me. "Preston froze my research accounts," I said flatly. "He is trying to starve me out. He wants me to come crawling back, begging for mercy so he can take whatever is in Grandpa's envelope." Mabel did not flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "Then we better see what your grandfather gave us to fight back with. Put the cup down, Vera. Get the envelope." I walked back to the couch, pulled the envelope from under the pillow, and brought it to the kitchen table. The morning light hit the red wax seal. I took a deep breath, grabbed a butter knife, and carefully pried the seal open. Inside, there was no long letter of explanation. There was only a single, heavy brass key with a number etched into it, 402. And a small piece of thick cardstock with a GPS coordinate handwritten in Grandpa's unmistakable scrawl. I looked at the coordinates. "I know this place," I said, my brow furrowing. "It is the First National Bank downtown. The old one." "Safety deposit box," Mabel confirmed, her eyes gleaming. "Alden kept a private box there for decades. Preston never knew about it." I looked at the key resting in the palm of my hand. It felt heavier than it looked. "What do you think is in it? Money?" Mabel smiled, but it was a wolfish, dangerous smile. "Alden was a scientist, Vera. Just like you. He didn't fight with money. He fought with data. Go get dressed. We have a bank to visit." The First National Bank was a massive, imposing building with high vaulted ceilings and marble columns. It felt more like a mausoleum than a financial institution. Grandma Mabel walked beside me, her back straight, her cane tapping rhythmically against the stone floor. We had called Vaughn, the lawyer, and he met us in the lobby, looking grave and professional. He led us to the private vault area deep underground. The air here was cool and smelled of metal and dust. The bank manager, a quiet man in a tailored suit, verified the key and my identification before leading us down a long corridor of polished steel boxes. He stopped at box 402, inserted his master key, and stepped back to let me use Grandpa's brass key. The lock clicked. I pulled the long metal drawer out and carried it to the private viewing room. Mabel sat on a velvet chair, her hands gripping her cane. Vaughn stood by the door, acting as a silent sentinel. I opened the lid. There were no stacks of cash, no gold bars, no secret jewelry. Instead, the box was crammed full of thick manila folders, USB drives, and a massive, bound ledger book. I reached in and pulled out the first folder. It was labeled in bold black marker, Blue Horizon Foundation, Audit and Findings. My breath hitched. I opened the folder. The first page was a summary document, stamped with the logo of an independent, highly aggressive forensic accounting firm. I started reading, and with every line my eyes scanned, my jaw dropped further toward the floor. Grandpa Alden had not just been sitting idly in his final years. He had hired private investigators and forensic accountants to quietly dismantle Gemma's entire operation. "Look at this," I whispered, sliding the papers toward Vaughn and Mabel. Vaughn picked up his reading glasses. "Good Lord," he muttered. The documents detailed a massive, systematic fraud. Gemma's Blue Horizon Foundation was nothing more than a glorified slush fund. The charity raised millions from wealthy donors at fancy galas. But the money did not go to ocean conservation. According to the audit, 85% of the funds were funneled through a series of shell companies controlled by Preston, eventually landing back in Gemma's personal accounts to fund her lifestyle, the yachts, the designer clothes, the luxury trips. But it got worse. I pulled out another folder. It contained photographs, flight logs, and forged documents. Gemma had falsified over 200 hours of court-mandated community service, which she had received after a quiet DUI arrest 2 years ago that Preston had paid heavily to keep out of the press. She claimed she was doing reef cleanups, but the flight logs proved she was in Paris during those exact dates. He tracked every penny, Vaughn said, flipping through the ledger. Your grandfather compiled a bulletproof case of wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. The IRS and the FBI would salivate over this. If this goes public, Gemma is looking at federal prison time. And Preston, as the shadow director of those shell companies, will go down with her. I stared at the USB drives. My hands were shaking again, but this time, it was from the sheer magnitude of power I was holding. Grandpa knew. He knew everything. He saw right through their glittering facade, right to the rotting core of their empire. And he had weaponized it, placing the detonator right in my hands. Why didn't he go to the police himself? I asked, looking at Mabel. Because he was dying, Vera, Mabel said softly. And because he knew they would try to crush you after he was gone. He built this arsenal for you. So you would never have to be a victim again. I looked back down at the documents. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars stolen under the guise of saving the very oceans I bled to protect. They had mocked me for being poor, for being dirty, for playing in the mud, while they were wearing suits bought with stolen charity money. Vaughn closed the folder. Vera, as the executor of this specific addendum, I must advise you. You have a choice. We can hand this over to the authorities quietly, let the system handle it. Or what? I asked, looking up at him. Vaughn adjusted his tie. Or you use it as leverage. Preston holds your research accounts hostage. You hold his freedom. It is a dangerous game, but it is your right. I looked at Grandma Mabel. She was staring at me, waiting to see what the girl who had always run away would do now. I thought about the fake phone number. I thought about Grandpa crying for me in an empty room. I thought about Stella's mocking message. I thought about my corals dying because Preston wanted to teach me a lesson. I do not want to hand it over quietly, I said, my voice eerily calm. I do not want them to negotiate a plea deal behind closed doors. They like performing for an audience. They love the spotlight. So, I am going to give them the biggest stage they have ever had. Mabel's lips curved into a proud, fierce smile. That is my girl. What is the plan? We are going back to the house, I said, gathering the folders and shoving them back into the box. Grandma, you need to make a phone call. Tell Preston and Daphne to bring Gemma and whoever they need to finalize the transfer of this coastal property. Tell them you are ready to surrender it. Tell them I am broken and ready to concede. Vaughn raised an eyebrow. You are inviting them to the cabin? Tonight? Yes, I said, grabbing my phone. And I need to make a call too. Who are you calling? Mabel asked. I looked at the contact list on my phone, scrolling down until I found a name I had not spoken to in months. Yara. She was a fiercely independent investigative journalist who had been sniffing around Gemma's charity for a year but could never find the hard proof. I am calling the press, I said. I hit dial. It is time to burn it all down. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks of orange and purple across the churning ocean. The cabin was deadly quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a massive storm. Grandma Mabel sat in her armchair, her posture rigid, her cane resting across her knees like a drawn sword. She had made the call 2 hours ago. I listened from the kitchen as she played her part flawlessly. Her voice had trembled just enough, sounding old, tired, and defeated. She told Preston that she could not fight anymore. She told him I was in tears, ready to sign whatever documents he wanted as long as he unfroze my research funds. Preston had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. According to Mabel, he sounded positively gleeful. He promised to be there by 8 o'clock sharp, bringing Gemma and a property appraiser to formally evaluate the cabin and the surrounding shoreline for transfer into Gemma's trust. They are coming to take the house, Mabel said, staring out the window at the darkening sky. They think they are coming to strip the flesh off our bones. Let them think that, I said, pacing the wooden floorboards. The dining room table was cleared. In the center sat the heavy leather box we had brought back from the bank. Inside it lay the explosive audit, the forged flight logs, the proof of their absolute moral bankruptcy. At 7:30, a modest sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. I opened the door to let Yara in. Yara was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 30s, wearing a leather jacket and carrying a heavy camera bag. She had been chasing the Blue Horizon Foundation story for months, constantly stonewalled by Preston's expensive lawyers. When I called her and told her I had the internal audit, she practically teleported to the coast. "You better not be messing with me, Vera," Yara said, stepping inside and quickly scanning the room. "If this is a trap to get me to back off, Gemma." I opened the leather box and slid the first forensic summary page across the table. Yara leaned in, her eyes darting across the text. Her breath hitched. She looked up at me, her expression shifting from skeptical to utterly feral. This is a federal indictment in a box," she whispered, tracing the numbers with her finger. 85% embezzlement? Forged community service? Oh my God, Vera. This will destroy them. "That is the point," I said coldly. "But you cannot publish it yet. I need you to wait in the study. Keep the door cracked. I want you to record everything they say. When the time is right, you step out. And I want you streaming it live." Yara grinned, unzipping her bag and pulling out her equipment. "You got it. I have 50,000 subscribers who are going to love this Friday night special." She slipped into the dark study just off the living room, disappearing into the shadows. Vaughn arrived a few minutes later, carrying his pristine leather briefcase. He looked nervous but determined. He took his place standing quietly by the fireplace, adjusting his tie. The clock struck 8. Gravel crunched loudly outside. The glaring LED headlights of a massive, black Mercedes SUV cut through the darkness, illuminating the living room walls. The engine rumbled aggressively before shutting off. Car doors slammed. Voices carried through the thin coastal air. "Remember, Daphne, play nice until she signs." Preston's voice drifted clearly through the window. "Oh, please." "She is probably crying in a corner," Gemma's voice followed, dripping with disdain. "Let's just get this over with. I have a party in the city at midnight." My heart hammered against my ribs. My palms were sweating, but my mind was violently clear. I looked at Grandma Mabel. She gave me a single, slow nod. The front door opened without a knock. Preston strode in as if he owned the place, wearing a sharp designer suit that looked ridiculous in the rustic cabin. Daphne followed, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, her nose wrinkled as if the smell of the ocean offended her. Gemma walked in last, busy typing on her phone, wearing another white outfit, looking completely bored. Behind them trailed a nervous-looking man holding a clipboard, Declan, the appraiser. Preston surveyed the room, his eyes landing on me, then on Mabel and finally on Vaughn. He smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips. "Well, Mabel." "Vera," Preston said, walking toward the dining table. "I am glad you finally saw reason. There is no need for this family to fight. We are just here to formalize things." "Formalize," I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. "Yes," Daphne chimed in, offering a fake, sugary smile. "Gemma is so excited to turn this old place into a coastal retreat for her foundation. It is for a good cause, Vera. You should be proud to contribute." Gemma finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes. "Have you cleared out your junk yet, Vera? I have an interior designer coming on Monday. This whole rustic aesthetic is depressing." I stared at her, feeling the heat rising in my chest. "You haven't even appraised it yet, Gemma." Preston waved his hand dismissively. "Declan, do your job. Make it quick." The appraiser, Declan, scurried forward. He did not look around the house. He did not measure anything. He simply looked at a piece of paper on his clipboard, cleared his throat, and said, "Given the structural degradation, the proximity to the erosion line, and the outdated facilities, I appraise this property and the surrounding coastal acreage at $200,000. I almost laughed. 200,000? The land alone was worth 5 times that. Preston had clearly bought the appraiser to lowball the estate so he could transfer it cheaply and avoid taxes. 200,000, Preston repeated smoothly, pulling a pen from his pocket. Very generous, considering the state of it. Sign the transfer, Vera. You sign this, relinquishing your claim, and I will call the bank right now to unfreeze your little science project. He slid a contract across the table toward me. He tapped the pen on the dotted line. I looked at the pen. Then I looked up, meeting my father's eyes. The arrogance there was blinding. They thought I was a bug waiting to be squashed. They had no idea they had just walked into the slaughterhouse. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I took a step back and looked at Vaughn. Vaughn, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent room. I believe we have another addendum to read. Preston's smile vanished. What are you talking about? Sign the damn paper, Vera. Vaughn stepped forward into the light, opening his briefcase. I am afraid I cannot allow her to do that, Preston. Because this property does not belong to the primary estate. Daphne gasped. Gemma dropped her phone. Preston's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The trap had snapped shut. There was no way out. If you've ever been abandoned by your family and want to see the moment they pay the price, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you so much. The air in the room grew so thick you could choke on it. The sound of the crashing waves outside seemed to fade away, replaced entirely by the deafening silence inside the cabin. My father, Preston, stood frozen, his pen hovering just an inch above the dotted line of the transfer contract. He slowly lowered his hand, his head snapping toward Vaughn. What the hell are you talking about, Vaughn? Preston demanded, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. This property was in my father's name. It is part of the primary estate. I am the executor of that estate. Gemma inherits the real estate portfolio. That is what the will stated this afternoon. Vaughn did not flinch. He walked slowly toward the dining table, his polished shoes clicking softly against the old wood. He set his briefcase down, unlatched it with 2 sharp clicks, and pulled out a thick stack of documents printed on heavy, watermarked paper. You are the executor of the primary trust, Preston, Vaughn corrected, his tone perfectly even and utterly professional. However, you are operating under a false assumption. This coastal property, including the cabin, the private dock, and the 300 acres of surrounding shoreline, has not been part of Alden's primary estate for over 5 years. My mother, Daphne, let out a short, incredulous laugh. She pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders, looking at Vaughn as if he had lost his mind. 5 years? Do not be ridiculous. We pay the property taxes through the family holding company. You paid the taxes on a phantom deed, Daphne, Vaughn replied calmly. 5 years ago, Alden quietly transferred ownership of this entire parcel of land to a newly formed, privately held corporate entity. He instructed me to file the paperwork under maximum confidentiality. You have been paying taxes on a shell to keep up appearances, precisely because Alden knew you would try to sell it the moment his heart stopped beating. Gemma finally put her phone down. Her bored expression vanished, replaced by a dark, ugly skull. Are you telling me this old shack does not belong to me? She snapped, her voice shrill and grating. Because if that is the case, why the hell did you drag me out here in the middle of the night? I have a charity gala to attend. I am the guest of honor. You are here, Gemma, because your grandmother requested your presence to finalize the transition, Vaughn said, turning his gaze toward her. And because the true owner of this land needs to formally accept the transfer in front of all interested parties. Preston slammed his hand down on the table, making the appraiser, Declan, jump backward in terror. Enough riddles. Preston roared, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive silk collar. Who owns the land, Vaughn? Vaughn looked at me. Then he looked back at Preston. The entity is called the Alden Oceanographic Research Institute. And the sole, uncontested director and primary shareholder of that institute is your daughter, Vera. The reaction was instantaneous. Daphne gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck. Declan the appraiser shrank back against the wall, clutching his clipboard like a shield, realizing he had just walked into a bloodbath. Gemma stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer outrage. But it was Preston whose reaction was the most violent. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and gray, before a dark, furious red crept up his neck. "That is a lie," Preston shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is a broke, pathetic little researcher. She does not own a corporate entity. My father was practically senile in his last years. You manipulated him into signing this, didn't you, Vera? You disgusting, greedy little snake." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply looked at him, my posture straight, feeling the immense, protective presence of Grandpa Alden standing right behind me. "Senile?" I asked softly, the words slicing through his screaming like a razor blade. "Grandpa was sharper on his deathbed than you have ever been in your entire life, Preston. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew you would try to take everything. He knew you would try to starve me out by freezing my bank accounts. He anticipated every single one of your pathetic, predictable moves." Preston lunged forward, but Grandma Mabel suddenly slammed her heavy wooden cane against the floorboard. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Take one more step toward her, Preston, and I will have you arrested for trespassing on private property," Mabel snarled, her blue eyes blazing with a feral, protective fury. "You are standing in Vera's house. You will show her respect, or you will get out." Preston stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at his mother, realizing for the first time that the frail, grieving widow he thought he could bully was actually a fortress of iron. "Mabel," he pleaded, his voice cracking, adopting a sudden, sickeningly sweet tone. "Mother, please. Be reasonable. This land is worth millions if we develop it. We can build luxury resorts. We can expand Gemma's foundation headquarters here. Vera does not know how to manage real estate. She plays in the mud. She will ruin it." "I play in the mud," I repeated, a cold smile forming on my lips. "Let's talk about what this mud is actually worth, shall we?" "Vaughn?" Vaughn adjusted his glasses and picked up the thick stack of documents. He cleared his throat, the sound carrying heavily in the tense room. As I was saying, Vaughn began, his voice projecting authority. "This land is now the official headquarters of the Alden Oceanographic Research Institute. But the land is only a fraction of the endowment." "Endowment?" Daphne whispered, her eyes starting nervously between me and the lawyer. "What endowment?" "Before his passing, Alden liquidated his private offshore accounts," Vaughn explained, turning the page. "Accounts that he accumulated through his own patents and independent consulting over 40 years. Accounts that were never part of the family holding company. He transferred the entirety of those funds into an irrevocable trust designed exclusively to fund Vera's institute." Preston's jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. "How much?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Vaughn looked Preston dead in the eye. $80 million. Fully funded. Tax-exempt. And placed under the sole, unchallengeable control of Vera. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. $80 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and crushing. Gemma's $50 million estate suddenly looked like pocket change. "No," Gemma breathed, shaking her head frantically. "No, no, no. That is my money. He was my grandfather too. I am the one with the charity. I am the one saving the oceans. This is fraud." "You want to talk about fraud, Gemma?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "Just wait. We are not finished." Vaughn raised a hand, demanding silence. "There is one final clause in the trust formation," he said, his tone growing darker. "Alden was a thorough man. He wanted to ensure that his legacy of oceanic preservation was never tainted by scandal. Therefore, he included a collateral restitution clause." "What does that mean?" Preston demanded, sweating profusely now. "It means," Vaughn read directly from the paper, "if any member of the immediate family, specifically Gemma, is found to be operating a fraudulent, misleading, or criminal enterprise under the guise of marine conservation, the primary estate awarded to her today, the $50 million, will immediately be frozen." Those assets will be seized and redirected to Vera's Institute to repair the reputational damage done to the family name. Preston stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a chair. He practically fell into it, his breathing shallow and rapid. Daphne covered her mouth, a muffled sob escaping her lips. They knew. They knew exactly what they had been doing with the Blue Horizon Foundation. And they suddenly realized Grandpa Alden knew it too. Before they could even process the magnitude of the trap they had just stepped into, Vaughn reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment paper. Vera, Vaughn said, his voice softening, dropping the harsh legal tone. Alden left this letter for you. He asked me to read it to you in front of them, so they would hear the truth they tried so hard to bury. I felt a lump form in my throat. I nodded, my vision blurring slightly with tears I refused to let fall in front of my abusers. Vaughn unfolded the paper. The room was deathly still as he began to read. To my dearest Vera, my brilliant little scientist. If you are hearing this, it means I have embarked on my final expedition. I know the past few years have been a dark, lonely ocean for you. I watched you swim against the current of a family that refused to see your worth. I watched them praise empty glamour while ignoring your tireless, genuine passion. I saw it all, Vera. Even when you thought I was blind, I saw you. A tear escaped my eye, tracking hotly down my cheek. Grandma Mabel reached over and squeezed my hand tightly. Preston and Daphne built a world of glass and mirrors. Vaughn continued reading, Grandpa's voice echoing vividly through his words. They valued perception over reality. They chose a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. And they tried to force you into their mold. But you, my brave girl, you refused to break. You kept your hands in the earth and your eyes on the horizon. I looked at my parents. Daphne was weeping silently, perhaps out of genuine shame, perhaps out of fear of losing her wealth. Preston was staring at the floor, completely hollowed out. Do not let their bitterness infect your heart, the letter went on. You are not a shadow in your sister's light. You are the only true light this family has left. I have given you the resources to change the world because I know you are the only one who actually will. Build your reefs, Vera. Heal the waters. And never, ever let anyone tell you that you belong in the mud again. I love you, my little scientist. Forever. Vaughn folded the letter and handed it to me. I pressed it against my chest, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. The years of neglect, the constant belittling, the theft of my work, the agonizing isolation, it was all washed away by the undeniable proof that I was loved, valued, and respected by the greatest man I ever knew. But the peace was broken a second later by the sound of Gemma throwing a violent tantrum. This is ridiculous. Gemma shrieked, stomping her expensive heels on the floor. I am not listening to this garbage. That old man was crazy. You think you can take my money, Vera? You think a stupid clause about my charity means anything? My foundation is untouchable. I have celebrity endorsements. I have state senators at my galas. You have nothing but a bunch of dying fish. I carefully placed Grandpa's letter in my pocket. I looked at my sister, watching her red-faced, screaming meltdown. I felt no anger toward her anymore. I only felt a cold, clinical disgust. Untouchable? I echoed. That is a very dangerous word, Gemma. Especially when you leave such an obvious paper trail. I reached for the heavy leather box sitting on the table. It was time for the execution. If you want to leave right now, Gemma, you can, I said, resting my hand on the lid. But before you walk out that door, you might want to see what else Grandpa Alden left for me. Because while you were busy taking selfies on yachts, he was busy hiring forensic accountants. Gemma froze. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a porcelain doll. What? She whispered. I flipped the lid of the box open. The truth about Gemma's charity fund is about to be exposed live to tens of thousands of viewers. Guess how she'll react? Stay tuned. I pulled out the first thick folder from the box and threw it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. The bold black letters on the cover read, Blue Horizon Foundation, Audit and Findings. Let's talk about your untouchable charity, Gemma, I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. Let's talk about the 85% embezzlement rate. Let's talk about the shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands under Preston's signature. Preston shot up from his chair as if he had been electrocuted. "Shut your mouth, Vera," he bellowed, panic ripping through his voice. "You do not know what you are talking about. Those are fabricated documents. I will sue you for defamation. I will drag you through court until you are entirely bankrupt." "You cannot sue the truth, Preston," I fired back, pulling out more folders and tossing them across the wood. "Here are the flight logs. Here are the forged community service certificates from the state court. You claimed Gemma was doing reef cleanups in Florida when her passport and these photographs clearly show she was drinking champagne in Paris. That is a violation of a court order. That is a federal crime." Daphne let out a horrifying, high-pitched wail. "Preston, tell her to stop. Tell her to give those to us. If those get out, we are ruined. We will lose everything." Preston lunged for the table, desperate to grab the folders, but Vaughn stepped smoothly in his path, holding up a hand. "I strongly advise against touching my client's property, Preston. That would be attempted destruction of evidence." Gemma was hyperventilating now. Her perfect influencer mask had shattered entirely. She looked like a terrified, trapped animal. "You cannot do this, Vera," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Please. My brand. My followers. If they see this, they will cancel me. My sponsors will drop me. I will have nothing." I stared at her, feeling no pity. "You built your brand by stealing my research notebook, Gemma. You built your following on a throne of lies. You stole from people who thought they were saving the ocean, just so you could buy designer bags. You deserve to lose it all. I am calling the police." Preston shouted, pulling his phone out, his hands shaking violently. "You stole these files. This is blackmail." "No, Preston," a new voice interrupted. "This is journalism." The heavy wooden door to the study creaked open. Yara stepped out of the shadows. She was holding her professional camera rig, a bright LED light illuminating the horrified faces of my family. A small microphone was clipped to her collar, and she was holding a smartphone mounted on a gimbal. Preston dropped his phone. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "My name is Yara. I am an independent investigative journalist," she said with a razor-sharp smile. "And right now I am live streaming this entire confrontation to 50,000 subscribers on my channel. We have been live since you walked through the front door, Preston." Daphne screamed and threw her hands over her face, turning away from the camera. Gemma let out a horrifying shriek, dropping to the floor and hiding her face against the sofa cushions. "Turn that off," Preston roared, charging at Yara. Yara did not even flinch. She just took a step back, keeping the camera perfectly steady. "I would not do that if I were you, Preston. The chat is going crazy right now. Actually, let me read some of these comments for you." Yara looked at her smartphone screen. User OceanLover99 says, "I donated $2,000 to Blue Horizon last month. I am calling the Attorney General right now." User Truthseeker says, "Did that guy just admit to bribing an appraiser?" Oh, wait, that is a great question. Let's look at the appraiser. Yara swung the camera toward Declan. Declan was pressed flat against the wall, sweating profusely, his eyes wide with sheer terror. The moment the bright light hit his face, he broke. He threw his clipboard on the ground and raised his hands in surrender. "I had nothing to do with this," Declan screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. "Preston paid me. He transferred $10,000 into my account yesterday to value the property under $200,000. He said it was just a family formality. I did not know about the fraud. I will testify. I will give you the bank records. Just keep me out of prison." "Declan, shut your damn mouth," Preston screamed, lunging at the appraiser. But it was too late. The confession was live on the internet. The damage was done. It was catastrophic, permanent, and entirely self-inflicted. The empire of lies my parents had built for decades had just collapsed in a matter of minutes. The cabin descended into utter chaos, a beautiful, poetic destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. Daphne was collapsed in the armchair, clutching her chest and gasping for air, her pearls rattling violently against her collarbone. My brand, my country club. They will expel us, she muttered incoherently, rocking back and forth. The embarrassment. The absolute humiliation. Preston was backed against the window, his chest heaving, his tie loosened. He looked at Yara's camera, then at the folders on the table, and finally, his desperate eyes landed on Grandma Mabel. "Mother," he pleaded, his voice stripped of all arrogance, reduced to a pathetic, whining beg. "Please. Make them turn the camera off. Make Vera give me the documents. We can settle this. I am your son. We are family. You cannot let them put me in prison." Mabel remained perfectly still. She leaned forward on her cane, her blue eyes piercing right through him. "Family?" Mabel asked, the word dripping with venom. "You stopped being my family the day you handed your dying father a fake phone number. You stopped being my family the day you told me Vera hated us. You traded your daughter's soul for a yacht, Preston. You reap what you sow. I have no son." Preston let out a broken sob, burying his face in his hands. Gemma slowly pulled her head up from the sofa cushions. Her face was a mess of smeared mascara and running foundation. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and terror. "You planned this," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You set us up. You wanted to ruin my life because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me." I walked around the table until I was standing directly over her. I looked down at the golden child, the sister who had taken everything from me, and smiled while doing it. "Jealous?" I asked quietly. "You think I am jealous of a life built on theft and lies? You wanted me to rot in the mud, Gemma. Preston wanted to starve my research to force me to my knees. But you both forgot a fundamental rule of nature." I leaned in closer, making sure Yara's camera caught every single word. "Seeds buried in the mud do not rot," I whispered. "They grow into trees. And the fake, plastic world you built? It only takes one storm to wash it all away. Consider this your storm. Now, get out of my house." Gemma stared at me, trembling uncontrollably. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her expensive purse, and ran toward the door, pushing past Yara without looking back. Daphne struggled to stand, her legs shaking. She didn't say a word to me. She didn't look at Mabel. She just walked out into the cold night air, a broken, defeated woman whose entire identity had just been erased. Preston lingered for a moment. He looked at the folders on the table. He knew the FBI would be knocking on his door by morning. He knew his assets would be frozen. He knew the collateral clause would strip the $50 million estate away to fund my institute. He had nothing left. "You will regret this, Vera," Preston rasped, trying to muster a final shred of intimidation. I crossed my arms. "I doubt it. Goodbye, Preston." He turned and walked out the door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him. Through the window, I watched the black Mercedes speed down the gravel driveway, disappearing into the darkness. The cabin was finally quiet again. Yara turned the camera off and let out a massive exhale. "Wow," she said, shaking her head. That was the greatest piece of journalism I have ever been a part of." The stream peaked at 80,000 viewers. "Every major news network is going to pick this up by midnight." "Thank you, Yara," I said, feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion hit me. Vaughn began gathering the documents, placing them carefully back into the leather box. "I will contact the federal authorities first thing in the morning, Vera. The collateral transfer of the $50 million will take some time in court, but with this evidence, it is a guaranteed victory. Your grandfather would be profoundly proud of you." I looked at Grandma Mabel. She was still sitting in her chair, staring at the empty space where Preston had stood. I walked over and knelt beside her. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. Mabel reached out and stroked my hair. A tear slipped down her wrinkled cheek, but she was smiling. "The storm is over, Vera," she whispered. "We finally have peace. Now it is time for you to build your legacy." 6 years. That is how long it has been since the night the storm finally broke. 6 years since the black Mercedes drove away from the cabin, taking the poison out of my life forever. Today, the Alden Oceanographic Research Institute is not just a piece of paper in a leather box. It is a massive, state-of-the-art campus spanning the coastal cliffs. We have 3 main laboratory buildings, a fleet of 5 research vessels, and a staff of over 200 brilliant scientists. Thanks to the $80 million endowment and the additional $50 million recovered from Gemma's seized assets, our coral grafting program has successfully restored over 400 acres of dying reefs across the globe. I stood on the deck of our flagship vessel, the wind whipping through my hair, the salty spray of the ocean cold and refreshing against my face. Callum, who was now my lead operational director, walked up beside me, handing me a steaming cup of coffee. "The latest data from the Southern Reef is in," Callum said, grinning broadly. "The new heat-resistant coral strains are thriving. Survival rate is at 92%. We did it, Vera." I took a sip of the coffee, looking out at the endless expanse of blue water. "We did," I agreed softly. As for my family, the universe delivered exactly what they earned. The fallout from Yara's live stream was catastrophic. The federal authorities descended on Preston the very next morning. The investigation uncovered decades of tax fraud and corporate espionage. Preston was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Daphne filed for bankruptcy shortly after, losing the country club memberships, the designer clothes, and the friends she valued more than her own daughter. She moved into a tiny apartment in a different state, too ashamed to ever show her face in high society again. And Gemma? The internet did what the internet does best. She was universally cancelled. Her sponsors dropped her within hours. The state attorney general forced her to pay massive fines for the charity fraud, draining whatever personal money she had left. Last I heard from a mutual acquaintance, the former multi-million-dollar lifestyle influencer was now working as a shift manager at a fast food drive-thru in the Midwest, wearing a polyester uniform instead of designer bikinis. The irony was almost poetic. I rarely thought about them anymore. They were ghosts of a past life. When the boat docked at the Institute's private harbor, I walked up the winding wooden path toward the old cabin. I had refused to tear it down. Instead, it sat at the center of the modern campus, a rustic reminder of where this all began. I opened the door. The smell of peppermint tea filled the air. Grandma Mabel was sitting on the porch swing, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching the sunset. She was 93 years old now, her body fragile, but her mind still as sharp as a diamond. She lived with me full-time, surrounded by young scientists who treated her like the queen she was. I sat down next to her on the swing. "Good day on the water?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the horizon. "The best," I replied, leaning my head against her shoulder. Mabel reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out a small, tarnished silver compass. It was heavy and antique, clearly well-loved. She placed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Alden wanted you to have this when you finally built your institute," Mabel said softly. "Open it." I clicked the small latch. The silver lid popped open. The compass needle spun wildly for a moment before locking firmly, pointing north. Etched into the inside of the lid, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, was a short inscription. "For Vera, who never loses her way." Tears pricked my eyes, but they were tears of overwhelming gratitude. I had spent my entire childhood feeling lost, invisible, and unloved. I had been told I was worthless. I had been told to rot in the mud. But I had found my way through the dark. I had built an empire of truth, science, and healing. I was not the black sheep. I was the one who broke the generational curse. I closed the compass, holding it tightly against my heart as the sun dipped below the ocean, casting a brilliant golden light across the water. Many distant relatives have messaged me saying I was too cruel to push my parents and younger sister to the brink. They say I should share some of my inheritance with them to maintain peace. What do you think? Was I wrong to take everything from them to protect my grandfather's legacy? Please let me know your opinion. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found this story interesting and empathized with what I went through, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to follow more fascinating stories on the channel. See you in the next video.